Hello everybody and welcome to the Wheeler Centre in the Fifth Estate. I'm Sally Warhaft and it's just a tremendous pleasure tonight to introduce our guests. In the middle is the Chief of our Army, the big boss, Lieutenant General David Morrison. And David, and I've been told I can call him David, and I must or I'll be court-martialed. David joined the Army in 1979 after completing the first of his degrees, a BA at the Australian National University. He was appointed a member of the Order of Australia in 1999 for his services to the Army, and he has since then collected and this is just some of them, I think, an Australian Active Service Medal, an International Force East Timor Medal, a Defence Force Service Medal and an Australian Defence Medal. And in fact, in my research for tonight, I've learned quite a lot about what it takes to be the Chief of the Army, and it's an extraordinary achievement, David, and we're very, very grateful for you to coming here tonight to talk to us.
Real pleasure to be here.
And on the left flank, my left flank, we are very lucky to have Greg Sheridan. Now, they don't give medals for journalism, do they, Greg?
Jail sentence.
Just move that microphone a little bit closer. Yep. But if they did, I know you would be covered in them. Greg, of course, is the foreign editor for the Australian newspaper and one of the most influential journalists in Australia, and has particularly studied the culture and the goings-on of the Australian Defence Forces. So welcome to you too.
Thanks,
and thank you.
Thank you.
I want to start by asking you, David, a broad question, I suppose, about what our defence priorities should be and what they are.
Okay, well, I mean, the best and I think the most fulsome description of that, Sally, is actually encapsulated in our current white paper, which was released by the government in 2009. Now, some in the audience would know that the government has asked us to reframe the white paper, and there'll be a new one delivered next year. But the 2009 white paper was a pretty good summary, in my view, about what the Australian Defence Force should do and be equipped to do in order for it to contribute to a whole-of-government approach to defending Australia and to defending Australia's national interests. And it says that the Defence Force needs to be a joint force, by which we mean Army, Navy, Air Force need to be able to work together. We need to be able to work with other government departments. We need to be able to work with coalition partners in order to do three big things: defend Australia and its interests. And that obviously involves a focus on the Australian mainland and our offshore territories, but also our interests, so our interests extend more broadly than the Australian mainland. Secondly, we need to be able to contribute to stability in our region, and that requires us to be able to move offshore and to take part in a range of activities, from humanitarian and disaster relief, as we saw with the Australian national response to the tsunami of several years ago, through to stabilisation and security operations that we've seen in places like East Timor or in the Solomons. And then the third aspect of that is that we have to be able to contribute to coalition operations to maintain global order. And there we look to our alliance, particularly with the United States. And that has seen in recent years the Australian Army, as part of the ADF and as part of the nation, conduct operations in places such as Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, that's as far as I'll answer at the moment, because otherwise it sounds like a military lecture, and everyone could do well to avoid that.
That white paper, the Force 2030 paper, was based on an assumption that that China's influence in the region was going to increase, and that Australia could perhaps not rely on the US to the same degree that it has in the past for its protection. I'd like to ask both of you if you agree with that presumption, which now seems to have changed, if that's correct.
I'd be as bold as to disagree with the way you described it. I think that what the white paper did was it said, look, these are the tasks for the Australian Defence Force in a democratic country with interests not just in the region but globally, that recognises its place in the family of nations in alliance with major partners such as the United States, but also with the United Nations. And it certainly acknowledged that in the life of what it saw itself, the white paper, it saw a major feature of the global dynamic being the rise of China. But despite, I think, some readings of the white paper, it wasn't meant as a confrontational stance at the outset. It simply said, look, China will rise, it's inevitable. We, like a number of other countries, are really wanting to see a peaceful rise of China with open transparency as much as is possible with where China wants to position itself in the world. I also think that the white paper certainly didn't see us falling short in terms of our alliance with the United States. I think that there was a strong belief that the ANZUS Treaty is the bedrock of Australian security, but it recognised that as a middle power, Australia must have and should have a degree of self-reliance in terms of its own defence.
Greg.
Well, Sally, I'd agree with the proposition that the white paper was based on the idea that China's power would rise very dramatically. I disagree with the idea that it thought that we couldn't rely on the United States. Now, I would normally call General Morrison General, but he's instructed me to call him David, so I'm going to do that. Because, as you know, we journalists are inherently very hierarchical people and tend to salute. But David has to be a bit diplomatic about these things, and whereas my job is to be as undiplomatic as possible, all the time, to take every trend to its illogical and most dramatic conclusion.
Well, please do that for us, Greg.
Now, I'd just make a couple of points about the white paper. One is the secret grammar of all of Australian defence is our absolute reliance on the United States. No government for many, many decades has funded the Australian Defence Force to an extent that we could ever act significantly independently of the United States. Our dependence on the United States intelligence and also strategic heft and logistics and also simply their ordnance and manpower and size and everything is overwhelming. So there's often a kind of a phony debate in Australia about self-reliance versus will we sign up to the United States? The truth is, if nobody ever takes a shot at us, we'll be okay, but if anybody ever does take a shot at us, we'll be very heavily dependent on the United States. And the white paper didn't diminish that. But I also do think that the white paper, and certainly Kevin Rudd, saw a big security challenge for us in the rise of Chinese power. Most of China's extraordinary military expansion has been directed at technologies which allow it to hit and hurt the American Navy. And in response to that, the Americans have developed what they call their air-sea battle doctrine, which is a way of hitting the Chinese, to nullify what they call the asymmetric warfare that the Chinese are envisaging. Now, our capabilities are always designed to fit in with the American capabilities, and our 12 subs were designed to give us an independent indigenous capability, but they were also designed to fit in absolutely to the American capability. In fact, other service chiefs, not David, have said to me, it's very difficult to get the Australian services to join the Australian Defence Force because the Australian Navy, for example, feels that it belongs to a much more prestigious body called the American Navy. And getting it to leave the American Navy in order to join the much smaller body called the Australian Defence Force is very challenging.
I think that's very hard, Greg. And, I would have to take issue on behalf of Ray Griggs, the Chief of Navy.
I could tell you which CDF said that to me, but I won't.
Well, David, you are a great fan of the Australian Navy, I gather, from what I've read. And in fact, you quote often Lord Grey, and he says the Army, from from Britain, but the Army is a projectile fired by the Navy.
It's a good dramatic effect.
It's a pretty cool quote, but is that the way you see the Army in Australia, particularly, you know, we're an island continent, that the Army is subservient in some way to the Navy?
No, definitely not subservient. I think Australia needs its ADF, its Australian Defence Force, more than it needs its Army or its Navy or its Air Force. The three services by themselves really don't count for very much, in my view. So you want a joint force. Able to operate, yes, obviously with coalition partners, should there be a requirement to do that. But as I said, and the last white paper was I think, pretty clear on this, Australia should, in its own right, have a degree of self-reliance, and it then gets down to a question of how much you want to spend to decide which degree you've got. Australia, when it is, I think, properly focused, now this is an individual view, has a maritime strategy. It sees the world as a whole. It doesn't border itself and its security concerns at our beaches. You know, we're not girt by beach, we're actually girt by sea. And therefore a maritime strategy that sees the Australian nation, its government and its defence force, should it be required, able to operate in a littoral environment away from Australia as being one of the ways we defend our nation, through defending our interests, through providing security to the region and so on and so forth. The Army has to be able to operate in that type of joint force. And certainly the purchase of these two large amphibious ships that are going to be part of the ADF inventory in the next few years will be an important step, in my view, to being able to do that practically. And the Army is very much focused on that. Now, there are some that question the size of the ships or the role. That's a democracy at work, and that's great. But I can tell you, as a soldier who has to deal with the practical business of strategy, size does count, and the more you can put onto a ship, the less you will need when you get to a place where getting what you need is much more difficult. So these ships are going to be, I think, very important. How we'll protect them, what role they'll play, that's the subject of further debate. But I think that we're on the right path, and then it's a question of how much the government of the day wants to fund the Defence Force to achieve those effects.
Sally, if I could offer two counterpoints to David's exposition there. One is that of course, the government has just decided that it's not going to fund anything, and if the trend of this year's budget is maintained over several years, we will have a larger aid budget than we have a defence budget, and we'll have a larger secret intelligence service than we have diplomatic corps, if that should be projected out. You can only pay on performance, not promise, and the government's performance is to take a massive amount out of defence. Now that threatens, my second point is that threatens the jointness that David is talking about. But I'd have to say, as an observer, jointness in Australian military affairs is an ideal which is never reached. If you look at our deployments, they tend to be single service deployments in support of American operations overwhelmingly. So we send the Army to Afghanistan, we send a naval ship to the Persian Gulf. We specifically avoid anything like taking responsibility for a whole province in Afghanistan and integrating our air power and our army and everything. And that's what I say is the secret grammar of our defence strategy. Really, our defence insurance premium is just to turn up with the Americans and hope they'll turn up for us.
That wasn't the case in East Timor. In 1999, that was a...
But that wasn't a combat mission.
Well, look, I was there running military operations, and it was pretty exciting. Quite a number of days that I spent in country, Greg. Was it as confrontational as Afghanistan? No. Or Iraq? No. But Australia was the lead nation, and there were 15,000 troops in East Timor at the latter part of 1999 and 2000, and we had an Australian headquarters commanding it. It was very much a joint force. Most of the sea and airlift after the initial deployment came from either RAAF or Royal Australian Navy assets, and it stayed that way throughout the entire commitment to East Timor. I agree with the point that you're making, but I don't think that you're looking at it quite appropriately as a glass half empty equation. I'm not. I've got to manage it, and I actually think that the ADF is in good shape. Yes, of course, we want levels of funding that we have had over the last decade, but as I said publicly and at Senate estimates a few weeks ago, you've got to manage this with a national budget. There will still be $24 billion of the Australian taxpayers spent on the ADF, or the Defence Force, in this coming financial year. And while there is a reduction in financial year 12-13, and that will have an impact, and there are projected further reductions across the forward estimates period, the next 4 financial years, the situation is not that the sky is falling. We still have a very sound, cohesive and joint ADF. And I don't actually think that we in the Defence Force get quite the credit I think is probably due, in terms of at the very highest level remaining true to a joint force capable of joint operations in concert with a coalition partner should it be required.
Well, David, let me just ask you, let me say I have infinite respect and admiration for what the ADF did in East Timor. I'm not diminishing that. But it wasn't really a combat operation. I don't think we lost any soldiers killed in combat. When was the last, whereas in Afghanistan and Iraq we were in combat, when was the last combat operation that we did as a joint exercise rather than as a deployment, a single service deployment supporting
You're talking about a training exercise?
No, an actual combat. I mean, in Iraq and Afghanistan, we were killing people and getting people killed.
Can I actually just cut in here? I want to get to the budget shortly. I've got some specific questions, but can I tackle this in a slightly different way, which was a question about the tyranny of distance for the Australian Defence Force, and it would seem to me sending the Air Force and the Navy and the Army all at once for a combined operation somewhere like Iraq is not as simple as most other parts of the world. So how does our distance affect the planning and the execution of operations where we're asked to help the rest of the world? It must make it difficult to combine the forces.
Well, I think, Sally, what it says to a planner, military planner such as myself, is that you've got to have assets that are capable of deploying over a significant distance, be it a ship or a plane or on board either ships or plane, the Army. Now, the purchase of C-17s and the purchase of the landing helicopter docks, these big amphibious vessels, are steps, in my view, in the right direction if you want to be able to do that. Just thinking about Greg's question, the operations in Afghanistan are joint. There are Air Force and Navy personnel with Army personnel in Afghanistan, and they are in harm's way as well. We don't have Air Force assets other than lift and unmanned aerial vehicles flying in Afghanistan, but they are crewed and flown by RAAF personnel, Greg. In Iraq, that was certainly the case. We have ships in the Gulf that provide support to our total national contribution. I know what you're getting at, but I think that the level of jointry in the ADF is good. We practice it, and we also see it on operations, and we can step up. The big problem, of course, is that if you don't keep doing that, it's very difficult to step any higher. And that's probably a segue to the whole issue around what the nation wants to spend on defence. Well,
it's described not just here but in US defence circles as the age of austerity for military, and how you do more with less is the question I'm sure chiefs of armies all over the world. Well, not all of them, many of them are actually expanding, but some of them are... Of
course, austerity means something different from the American military for what it means for the Australian military, but it's just worth observing that the percent of our gross national product which we are going to spend on defence this year is the lowest that it has been since 1938. The Mark Thompson of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, in his very illuminating defence budget document, said that since the White Paper was published in 2009, just under $21 billion has been taken or deferred from. Now, soldiers quite rightly have to defend this and make the best of it. That's their job in a democracy. However, I don't wear a uniform. I'm not under that constraint. And I think what it shows us is the absolute frivolous, unserious nature of this government when it comes to defence. It does something momentous and solemn like a white paper, and at the time makes profound statements about how this offers the most world standard, most secure basis for funding into the future, etc., etc. And you know that it didn't get implemented for 1 second of one day, and it meant nothing.
$5.5 billion has been taken out over the next 4 years, although you have said somewhere, David, that the true impact of that is more like $8.5 billion.
Well, there are unfunded pressures, Sally, already inside the defence budget to pay for, if you like, the back of office functions, our ICT backbone.
What's the ICT?
The information and communications and technology.
Yep.
Beg your pardon. All organisations use, but in an organisation like Defence, it gets a lot of use and it's fairly big and it's spread around the world. So there are unfunded pressures that take that to a considerable amount of money, and I agree that you can't have that money removed from what was being planned to be spent without it having an impact. It then falls on the shoulders of people like the Chief of the Defence Force, General David Hurley, and the service chiefs, with other senior members of the Department of Defence, to look at this realistically and say, OK, well, we understand that it is a government imperative to return the budget to surplus. That's what the elected government of the country has decided is going to be its course over the course of the next year, and all government departments and many taxpayers in this audience are going to contribute to that. So that's not been fought, and what we've done is we've looked at it to establish a couple of principles, and they actually go back to what I think is axiomatic to Force 2030 in the last white paper. You must have an ADF capable of operating as a cohesive whole, either by itself, if self-reliance is really the requirement, or in concert with the United States or with other regional countries. It's my assessment that despite a significant amount of money being adjusted inside the defence budget, we will still be able to do that. And it is my view that this coming white paper, which will be delivered before the election next year, will, from a defence point of view, remain true to that. And I believe it's very important.
Why do we need another one, though? I don't know if white papers come out of the defence budget.
We need another white paper for one reason: to reverse engineer the budget cuts. There's no other reason.
So it's all political. Is this a sort of result of the Gillard taking over from Rudd?
It's largely that. Rudd was committed to the 2009 white paper. Gillard hates anything to do with Rudd. Everyone who was associated with that white paper is now dead. Rudd was twice assassinated. Fitzgibbon is on the backbench. John Faulkner is on the backbench. Angus Houston is retired. Pizzullo, who wrote the white paper, has been exiled off to customs. They're all dead, and none of them is coming back.
I led the army effort for the last white paper. I got promoted, Greg.
Outstanding. But the reason we need a new white paper: has the strategic environment become more benign? No one could argue that. No one who lives in the real world could argue that. Has it changed fundamentally? No, of course not. The government keeps making dark hints about we don't need now such a big army because we're coming back from a decade of expeditionary forces in the Middle East, which I think is very bad news for David, and it almost certainly means the army's going to be cut.
Well, no. To be fair, the government has not said that. The government has maintained that uniform strength will remain as is up to, the analysis that will be done for this next white paper. So certainly in this next financial year, that is unadjusted, unchanged.
Although history says that whenever you bring troops home, there's cuts somewhere. Is that?
Well, history says this government doesn't want to spend $1 on defence and will cut soldiers just as it's cutting other capabilities.
And my only contribution to that would be to say that history also says that peace dividends are seldom accrued, and that any cuts to certainly the uniform strength of the ADF, and in my own case the Army, I think would have to be done with great strategic foresight, because I agree that many of the geostrategic challenges facing the country are unchanged from 2009. It is only, after all, 2.5 years. I am certainly on the public record as saying that a regular army of 30,000 in a nation of 22 million, with a gross domestic product annualised of over $1 trillion, is not, I think, exorbitant in any way, shape or form. And if we are going to be part of a cogent defence force capable of a maritime strategy, I don't believe the Army should be made smaller. Absolutely. I'm quite happy to be very unambiguous on that statement.
I think that's dead right. And Sally, further on the white paper, and obviously this only accrues to the politicians, not to anybody else. The 2009 white paper, there's a wonderful, hilarious passage in it where it says, by God, we need 12 submarines and we need them fast, and we better get moving this minute because it takes a long time to develop this technology and they're very expensive and it's hard to get them. And here we are in 2012, all these years later, and they've just announced they're going to have 2 new studies, and we won't make a decision in 2017. And anybody who thinks Julia Gillard and Stephen Smith are still going to be around in 2017, redeeming their promises. So from 2009, we did almost nothing on the subs. And, the defence industry calls it a valley of death. We've stopped buying things, so our capital budget has gone like that. And if it is ever to get back to white paper shape, it has to go back up like that. And, of course, it won't.
David, you say that we must be capable of defeating a near-peer competitor close to shore, and the approaches to Australia close to shore. Now, are we? And who would be considered a peer competitor?
I would not, for one moment, name a country because I don't need to. What do you have a defence force for? It's far too late at short notice to raise one. I mean, there is a lot of sunk cost in a defence force, and that's just the nature of defence. The comment that I have made, or the statement I have made, which I've allied to a message that I've certainly conveyed to the Army, is that we can't benchmark ourselves against the Taliban. A middle power such as Australia, with a global view of the world, needs to be able to field defence forces that are capable of both defending the nation and defending the nation's interests. And that is not just against militia groups or near criminal organisations such as the Taliban. They are ruthless and they've taken Australian soldiers' lives, but they don't use artillery. They don't fly weapons at us. They don't compete in the electromagnetic spectrum. But we need to be, absolutely we need to be capable of that. And that's the way the ADF has structured itself, and I think we'll, to remain credible, we'll continue to do so.
We have to shift already to culture because our hour is flying by, and I really want to have enough time to ask about this. Since 1995, there have been 13 major inquiries into various parts of the Australian Defence Force culture and behaviour. Most of these have been connected to women. I think certainly the majority of them have been connected to women. You've said that it's a terrible indictment, there's a systematic problem. the bad apple explanation just doesn't cut it. So what's going on? On the one hand, the Army and the Defence Forces are one of the most trusted and respected institutions in Australian life. I think most Australians have that from historically and till today, to recent operations. And yet there's a sense of this sort of hyper-masculine culture that I think people feel very distant from the Army too, in many ways. How do you explain it? What's going on?
Well, the Army certainly has, the Defence Force, but I'll speak specifically to the Army here. The Army has a wonderful and proud history. It's been won on the actions and indeed the sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of our fellow Australians during the course of the last 111 years of the Army's history. And history does count. It makes us who we are. It gives us frames of reference in order to sort of plan for the future, but it only goes so far. If you create myths and eulogise your past to such an extent, there is, I think, a section of your organisation who can then take all the wrong lessons from that, believe that the reasons that we were successful in various operations or various battles in our past is because we were tougher than everybody. And tough means we've got to exclude anyone we, this small clique, consider weak or unacceptable. Now, the Army is in no way, shape or form the only organisation to suffer from similar views. I mean, you can look at many organisations, again, which I won't bother naming because an audience as intelligent as yours, Sally, would know what I'm talking about. But you can't prosper with that as a view. Now, I'm quite certain that there are cultural issues in the Australian Army that must be addressed. To say that, what happens because, a couple of young soldiers behave badly, oh, well, that's because, of their upbringing, or that's just because they were, drinking too much, or, they must have had a bad day, or they had, some sort of psychological issue. That's not the answer. In part it is. Every individual act is still the act of an individual and for which the individual should be held accountable. But you have to look at the culture of the organisation that individual functions in. There is no one prouder of the Australian Army than me. There is no one prouder of the work that our men and women are doing here in Australia or overseas than me, and I see it every day. But I also know that we have a workforce that has got a lack of diversity. We don't have a good gender balance. Under 10% of the Australian Army's workforce is women. That's a problem. It's a problem in terms of culture. It's also a problem in terms of capability, which I'm happy to expand on in a moment. We also don't attract people from various ethnic groups in Australia. That's a problem. We're not going to be a proper reflection of Australian society if we don't do that. And my final point in answer to your question is that this isn't about feeling good, feeling because I'm trying to do something about balancing gender that gives me the warm feeling inside. Well, it does to a degree, but I get actually paid for the hard edge of defence, and I know that a better balanced workforce will make us more capable. And that's what I'm after. So I've said publicly that in my time as the Chief of Army, and that's only 2 years left now, so the clock is really ticking, we'll go from 10% to 12%. An extra 600 women in the Australian Army in 2 years. That means we have to retain women at a good rate, so we'll actually be having to recruit 600 more than what we thought. And we've got to change the way we recognise merit, have flexible workforce arrangements and a whole range of other initiatives to say to Australian women, we've got a job for you, and it's not because, we're going to feel good about you being part of us, although we will. We need you because the Army of the future actually has to be better balanced from a gender point of view and, as a result, made more capable. Sorry, long answer.
Sally, if I could offer a couple of comments on culture. One is, I don't think there's any other nation in the world which defines itself as much by its image of its armed forces as does Australia. And I'd even say the United States doesn't, because the Australian Defence Force, and especially the Army, play a central role in our key national foundation stories, which is not even quite the same in the United States. The experience of Gallipoli and the diggers in World War I is such a central part of the telling and realising of Australian identity, much more so, I'd say, than the War of Independence is in the United States or anything like that. Yet, paradoxically, we have a very small defence force, and most of our people don't have the good fortune to meet soldiers. So that's a paradox. I'd offer you two other thoughts on culture. One is, armies traditionally are pretty good about being integrated because they need to perform. They're like sports teams. The best institution in the United States after desegregation and after the 60s in terms of integration was the Army, the fastest and quickest. There are beautiful passages in Colin Powell's memoirs where he says, I drove through the South and couldn't stop at a garage to go to the bathroom because I was a black man. But when I walked onto a base, white men saluted me, and I was an officer, and I had authority. And a bit like sports teams, they don't really care what your background is, they care what you can do. And the final point I'd make on culture is this. One area where I think our appreciation of the military culture is deficient compared with the Americans is that we're very squeamish about saying what we want soldiers actually to do. There's a marvellous non-government organisation called the Liaison Office, which just wrote a report about our forces in Afghanistan, and it said the Afghans love the Australian soldiers much more than they love the Dutch. Why is this? Because the Australians give their kiddies chocolates or pat them on the head or are respectful of their women or create girls' schools or something? No. It said because the Australian soldiers hate the Taliban and kill them whenever they can, unlike the Dutch who tried to be their friends. And we are sometimes squeamish in discussing openly amongst ourselves that the role of a military is to apply deadly, lethal force to the nation's enemies. Now, that's a very special role. There are very few people in society we license to do that, and they have to do it within discipline and within a moral framework. But sometimes there's a squeamishness. You know, you say, why are we deploying the Marines in Darwin? So they can do disaster relief. Well, of course, that's disaster relief, but if that was their primary organisation, you'd have a disaster relief organisation. You wouldn't call them the US Marine Corps, which is a warrior corps. And I think our public discussion is sometimes deficient in realising that what we want soldiers to be is warriors.
So let's not be squeamish then. How many of the men in your army, in the combat forces, which right now they are only men, could shoot me if I was an enemy national?
Oh, well, I think that is such a hypothetical question, Sally, that
it's
I
not.
would really struggle to answer it.
Well, is it really? You're talking about putting Australian women in combat. You've got to assume that if that's happening here, at some point it's going to happen on the other end. It's something. That's what women in combat means, isn't it?
Look, I agree strongly with everything that Greg has just said. You know, the primary function of an army is to deliver, where required and at government direction, legitimise violence. Absolutely. You know, that there's that great quote from George Orwell about people such as us sleeping safe in our beds because rough men are standing vigil in the night, ready to visit violence on those who would do us harm.
And now there's a change to rough women.
Yes,
as
absolutely.
Well.
So, reconstructing Orwell, you would have to say rough men and women. To be completely gender neutral. Look, all my studies and everything that I have learned in discussion with armies that have gone down this path is that there is no gender impediment in terms of pulling a trigger, of being able to take a human life or to deliver violence that is sanctioned and legal. I don't think that I think debate around that is honestly meaningless. Women will perform as they are required to, should they be placed in the position. Now, Greg's right. We've got a bloody good army, and it's got a hard edge to it, and it does get out there and it does deliver sanctioned and legal violence against those who would do us harm. I don't make a distinction, though, about whether a man or a woman could do it.
You might not, but a lot of the men in your army might. How do you teach that? How do you change that?
Over time. I got asked a similar type of question some months ago, and I said, look, when I first joined the army back in 1979, the thought of serving with openly gay and lesbian people in your armed forces would have been considered an anathema. It was never discussed. It was something to be pushed aside. It wasn't don't ask, don't tell. It was, don't tell. We're certainly, even if we ask, don't tell. And that's quite different now. And, any it would be illogical to say that a member of the gay or lesbian community couldn't do everything required of them as a member of the Defence Force, because they are. They're doing a great job. It's the same with women. This will take time. The cultural issues, you're an anthropologist, you know better than almost anybody that cultural change takes time, and it takes the going down of a lot of false starts in certain areas. We will probably do that. The opening up of various combat roles to women, I think, is a good thing. We've already got women serving in our engineer corps. We've got women flying our helicopters in combat, but well beyond the wire right now, while we are talking here in Afghanistan and have had for years. We have women in our artillery corps. Flying all of our surveillance assets. We just don't have at the moment women in our armoured corps driving our tanks and our other armoured vehicles, and we don't have them as infantrymen. But if you maintain the standards, if you are able to deliver rough justice when it's needed, legitimised rough justice, then I have no doubt that if the standards are maintained and there are women who aspire to do that, they will be just as effective as men. And could I just say, there is more to an army than just taking of life.
Oh, of course, yeah.
And there are a range of other activities that we I think lead the world in terms of population protection and population support, where we have stood to the front, in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, but also in Timor and the Solomons and in various UN missions, where a force that has got a proper mix of men and women will be more capable. I mean,
we'd be leading the world, though, I would imagine, in putting women in combat roles.
No, there are a number of other armies that have already done that.
Are they actually doing it?
Yeah, the Canadians have had it for 20 years. Now, the pickup rate has been slow. And that goes to the point that I was making about cultural change. And I can talk about wanting to raise the number of women in the army to 12%. That's a benchmark that I'm quite happy to be held to account for, and I dare say I will be. I have refused and will continue to do so to set quotas on the number of women that we'll put into the infantry, for example, because that requires the right policy, the right workforce to, and workforce changes that will have to happen, has to require the right women to stand up and say, oh, this is for me, this is what I want to do, and I don't think that should be rushed. If it takes the next 20 years, it won't matter. We're already going down the path of being a better gender-balanced force.
Could I offer something for your audience here which they're not going to get anywhere else? This is a completely unique proposition. I am actually going to argue against the idea of complete gender neutrality in the army. I think that the infantry, the commandos, the SAS, I think in principle it's a bad idea to have women in those roles, and let me explain why. It might just sound as though I'm hopelessly reactionary, and probably I am, but on the other hand, I think there's an argument which modern ideology has with reality, where reality is always going to win. Just as recently as when I was an undergraduate in the 1970s, the mainstream feminist position was that women were inherently less violent than men. And feminism in those days tended to disparage and dislike the armed forces. I think that was a pity on the part of feminism, but I more or less agreed with the feminist analysis that women were inherently less violent than men, and that the world would be better if it was run by women, so the feminist argument went because they would be more gentle in the way they ran it. I agree with that. I think obviously there's complete equality between the sexes, but I don't think there's complete sameness. And in our own lives, reality and common sense asserts itself. Let me give you just two examples. If there is any home where a burglar comes in downstairs and husband and wife are upstairs in bed and they hear the burglar come, I think it would be 1 in a million where the husband says, well, you know, darling, this is an equal opportunity household. I think you better go down and deal with the burglar because I did it last time. And let me give you one other example, just one other example. You know, I've only moved to Melbourne a couple of years ago and I've come to love this magnificent sport of AFL, but I grew up with rugby league. I went to a Christian Brothers school where we played rugby league, and it was more or less compulsory that you had to have several bones broken in the course of your schooling, if not on the rugby league field, by the strap. But in any event, if you watch a National Rugby League game, you see a guy like Dave Taylor, 125 kilograms. He wants to do you a certain amount of legitimised violence, and he runs as hard at you as he can. Now, there is no suggestion anywhere that we should integrate NRL sides so that we can have women tackling Dave Taylor. I'm sure that probably amongst our 23 million people, you might find one woman who was crazy enough and big enough to tackle Dave Taylor. But it's just completely barking mad to try to do so. And anything which an NRL side has to do is only 1/1,000,000th of what a soldier has to do in a terrible close gunfight. So for infantry, direct combat roles, for commandos, for SAS, I think it's wrong in principle and it won't work in practice. And I'm happy to tell you I'm the only commentator in Australia who will say that publicly.
Well, good on you for expressing your views like that, and good on you for being the person in your household that tackles the burglars. I'm pretty sure in my household it might just be me, but I can't be that certain. David, this is your opportunity to sound like John Pilger.
Well, I mean, I don't agree with Greg because I have seen Australian female soldiers do the most extraordinary things, arduous, physically and mentally taxing, and perform not just equal to their male peers, but in other cases to exceed them. And I think that while there is a very legitimate ethical debate that probably hasn't really been held in this country about the notion of women involved in, you know, the most stark of military tasks. And I accept what Greg has said. My own view is that if there are women who want to do that, there should be no restrictions provided they can perform equally with all of their peers. And what I say to young male soldiers is, well, okay, hear what you're saying, but you know, we have physical employment standards. You'd better live up to them as well, because you're going to be held to account. The final point I'd make is that this is a voluntary thing. You know, we're not going to drop
You're not being overwhelmed,
no, we're not going to
David,
drop
with
shillings down into the glass of you know, our women and say, oh, well, you've now got the Queen or the King's shilling. Away you go. You go and join this battalion, or you know, you're off to the commandos. It will only be done on a voluntary basis. But I don't see why in a society as open as ours, why the opportunity should be closed off to women simply because of their gender.
I suppose I think that while you've still got major inquiries going on into the culture of the Defence Force between men and women as it is, it's an interesting time, to say the least, to bring in this new possibility.
I think that the incidents that occur that have been subject to reviews are all varied, and I said earlier that they're the acts of individuals, and individuals always have to be accountable in the first instance for their actions or their words or their whatever. But you've got if someone stood up prior to an event taking place and said, "Stop, this is unacceptable," in some instances it probably, it may not have had the desired effect, but I can assure you that probably in the majority it would have. I think that if there are more women as part of the army group, there is much more opportunities for a woman to say, "That is unacceptable. Don't do that. And if you do that, you will be reported." That's the other thing we need to do. We need to be more responsive to people who come forward and say, "Look, something has happened to me." I think in the past we have been either slow to react or not as supportive of those individuals as we should have been. And that is most unfortunate. And it does demean the history of the Australian Army. And while I'm the chief, I think I should do something about it, which is what I'm trying to do. The other point I'd like to make is that it goes to a great point that Greg made earlier. We have got a wonderful army, but anyone who believes the Anzac myth, that we were, able to just walk off the farm or off the factory floor and mix it with the best, is not reading history properly. There are no such things as natural armies. There aren't natural football teams. There's talent, without doubt, but that talent's got to be disciplined and it's got to be trained and it's got to have a culture and an ethos, and that's the only way it actually becomes a game-winning football team. It's the only way it is a war-winning army. There is no natural army. You only get the army that Australia has now through hard work and incredible dedication by the men and women that make up that army. That's why I believe that we should be funded properly. It's why I think that we've got a very strong ADF now, and we will continue to have one. It's why I believe that the army shouldn't be made smaller, because if we are smaller, we will not be able, despite the training, we will not be able to do all that I believe we will need to do. But the glass is still half full. Australia has got a great defence force. It's got people by some of the finest Australians I will ever meet. It needs to have more women. It needs to have more people from ethnic groups. It needs to be funded properly. And when it is, it will continue to do what it's doing now, which is making the nation proud and winning its wars.
Yes, just one quick word on the ethnic issue. I think, David provides fantastic leadership to the army, and, that's probably having said that probably has ruined his career now, and that's the end of him for sure. But one area where I am critical of the army is the ethnic diversity thing. Again, going to the American experience, the Iraq War was described as the first ever Hispanic invasion of the Middle East. Anybody who doubts Hispanics' loyalty to the United States has only got to look at their recruitment rates, which are way above white recruitment rates. And I think if you're willing to put your life on the line for your country, that's a pretty strong argument. And, the United States has an ongoing argument about Hispanic immigration and so forth, but one of the most powerful forces for integration and common citizenship is the experience of the Sanchez's and so forth in the American Army. And I'm not quite sure why we haven't done better in that respect, but certainly there's no argument about eligibility or capability or anything else, but we just haven't recruited many folks.
Does anyone in the audience have a question for either of our guests?
General, is there any concern in the military for the situation in New Guinea? It seems to me to be on the verge of imploding on itself, and it's very close to us.
I was in New Guinea in April. I have, of all the countries that I've visited in the world, I've been to New Guinea more than any other. So throughout my career I've been going backwards and forwards. I've lived in New Guinea. I've worked with the PNGDF, not just in New Guinea but in Australia and indeed in Bougainville as well. I think that there are areas of real tension in PNG society, probably made even starker with the influx of very considerable amounts of money as a result of the mining boom that's occurred in PNG. But I would make the point that while it may not be democracy as it's practiced in Canberra, it's still a democratic country, and there have been prophets of doom about Papua New Guinea since 1975, and Papua New Guinea solutions have been found to Papua New Guinea problems, as we saw most recently with the High Court deciding that, Prime Minister Samari no longer being in office, despite what the High Court, parts of the High Court said. Now, we haven't seen civil disturbance of a nature that either the PNGDF or the Papua New Guinea Constabulary haven't been able to deal with. It remains, our closest country geographically. We have great historical ties with PNG, and, I have many friends in Papua New Guinea. So I'm concerned, but I also think that they are standing on their own 2 feet, and they've got to tackle some very significant issues around corruption and around some other aspects of their society. But nonetheless, I think that they are managing pretty well, and we've got to give credit where credit's due.
Thank you.
Hello, Nick.
David. Changing the subject slightly, but kind of to continue with Greg's football analogy, when the ADF ran on the field in East Timor in 1999, it was a quarter of a century since the last time it had any serious match practice, and yet it performed creditably in the eyes of Australia and in the eyes of its major ally, the United States. What were the sort of success factors that kept the spirit of the institution and its professional skills alive in that long hiatus?
There were a group of men and women whom the nation will never know, who wear no campaign ribbons, who joined the army after Vietnam and left before Timor, who in the face of steady decline, both financially and from support from the Australian population, kept the faith, held standards high, made young officers like me learn the meaning of failure and learn from it. And when we were required to stand up, we managed to do so. And I think credibly is the right description. I'd give it probably a slightly higher mark, Nick, but you've always been a hard taskmaster. The point I'd make, though, is that Timor happened with really very little notice. I mean, you go back and look at the history. It was less than 6 months from really when the whole rise of popular support for independence from Indonesia, through to President Habibie's decision to give a vote to the East Timorese, through to the reaction of militia forces, through to international involvement to try and stem what was a very considerable amount of bloodshed in East Timor. And Greg's right. It wasn't like, operating in Uruzgan. The militia posed a real threat. And there was loss of life within the Interfed forces, and there was certainly loss of life in the militia side, within the militia as well, as a result of military actions that we took. But the bar was high, but not too high. I don't believe that there is anything in our geostrategic assessment that says that warning time will be any greater than the 6 months that we had to prepare for Timor. And I'm certainly of the belief that challenges facing the military could be significantly higher than those that were faced by the Interfed forces in 1999. And that says that we don't just have to keep the faith now, we actually need to have a force structure and a level of funding that means that when Australian men and women are called on at short notice on a dark night to stand in harm's way at the nation's direction, they have everything at their disposal to do just that.
just like to ask David, with the trend towards the Americans using drones, if you look into future 5, 10, 15 years, can you see people like yourself being less hesitant to send drones because it's only metal? Whereas
15 years from now, I'm going to have a decent golf handicap. You're right.
Yeah. So how do you see that? In the old days, you'd send human beings, so you perhaps would be a bit hesitant in sort of adopting that tactic. But if you're sending drones or whatever the future is going to bring, there may be not the restraint to perhaps think more strategically and say, well, we can kill more that way, but perhaps we should go this way?
Look, it's a really interesting question, and at just a military technical level, you can answer it fairly quickly and say yes, there will be a much greater use of unmanned systems, both air platforms or sea or subsurface or robots on land in the next 15 years than there are now, and we've seen an exponential increase over the last 12 years of military operations from where we were in 1999. Yes, the Americans have led the way, but we have unmanned aerial systems in the Australian Defence Force, and we will continue to go down that path as well. The more interesting dimension, and Greg will certainly have a view, I'm sure, it sits around the ethics of how you use that and what level of detachment do you have as part of the way you go about conducting military operations. Throughout history, the point of contact has grown from the point of a spear or the edge of a sword through to, very significant distance, hundreds of kilometres in the case of guided missiles. The unmanned aerial systems that you're talking about, the drones, are flown indeed by people well removed from the environment that the drone is operating in and the targets are actually in. I don't have an answer for that. I think that it's already the matter of significant debate, certainly in military circles, and I think increasingly in public circles as we come to grips with the growing remoteness of contact, military contact. But I don't know how that's going to be played out in Australia, hopefully sensibly.
Well, David, it's kind of you to invite a thought. I'd just say that it's an extension, as David says, of technology that already exists. I mean, remember in the Balkans Wars, the criticism of Clinton was that he wanted to do everything from the air and not put soldiers on the ground. In fact, I'm very reliably informed that Tony Blair said to him once, Bill, we're going to have to put soldiers on the ground here. And he said, Tony, I haven't done any focus groups on that. And But I'd just make 2 points. One is this: we will have to exercise exactly the same ethical judgment when we apply force at a vast distance as when we apply it up close. But as we will be able to touch our enemies at a distance, our enemies will be able to touch us at a distance, with missiles, with drones, with cyber war, with asymmetric weapons, with terrorism, and with everything else. And the second point, just going back to the earlier question about PNG and about Indonesia, although governments can't ever say this publicly, a breakdown of order in Papua New Guinea is one of the central contingencies that all Australian security planning takes into account. Another contingency that it's worth thinking about is the land border that both Papua New Guinea and East Timor share with Indonesia. When people sometimes think because we're an island and we're quite affluent, we have no complex security matters to deal with. But it's been a great success of Indonesian and Australian statecraft that the Papua New Guinea-Indonesia land border has been so peaceful for so long. If we ever are dealing with an even modestly unfriendly Indonesian government, it can cause a world of heartache for us across the Papua New Guinea border or the East Timor border, which in effect we have assumed security responsibility for, even if we haven't quite said it. And those are only two of an infinite number of possibilities of how things could become very dusty for us very quickly. So I think the lesson out of all that is don't abolish your Defence Force.
We're going to have to end it, sorry, on that note. So many more things I'm sure we all wanted to hear about. But, David, I've been well aware, for a couple of weeks waiting for tonight that you are somebody who has been woken up in the middle of the night at short notice and put yourself in harm's way, that you are a soldier as well as the Chief of the Army. And, I think it's a wonderful thing that you can make yourself available to the Wheeler Centre, to the home of books and literature and ideas in Melbourne, to an audience like this to answer everything that's been thrown at you. And thank you very, very much for that.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
And to Greg Sheridan, thank you very much too for risking certain court-martial in being so expressive and forthright and honest as you always are. Thanks to Greg as well.
Thanks very much, Greg. Thank you.
And if I can just remind the audience that the Fifth Estate is a fortnightly forum, so in 2 weeks' time we'll be back at 6:15 on a Tuesday evening, and our guest secretly for the next one, you're the first to know, is Maxine McHugh. So please put that in your diaries, and have a very safe and happy evening. Thanks for coming.